I'm Dimitri Gutas. I'm professor of Arabic here in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, the department which was lucky enough to count Ahmad Dallal as one of its faculty members some 10 years ago. So it is a great pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce Ahmed, this time as a Terry lecturer, and to welcome him here. I won't say too much about his educational career. It's relatively known, except to say that he had a relatively unusual background in that he has been trained both in science and in the humanities. Most of us are not that prescient to do this sort of thing, so we choose very early whether we should follow a career in the humanities or in the sciences. Ahmed showing, of course, great foresightedness. He decided to do both. And it shows in the fact that this seems to have been the perfect preparation for a historian of science. Ahmed is a historian of science with equal emphasis on both words. Unfortunately, the field of the history of science, at least as far as I can tell, suffers from the fact that most of its practitioners pay too much attention either to the one leg or the other. So there is the vast majority of them are scientists, and they work about the scientific achievements of previous generations and previous scholars, and all they are concerned about is to find out the particular mathematical formula or astronomical configuration that this author was able to come up with, and evaluate that or try to analyze it, so to speak. Or if it is in medicine, of course, the particular medical fact that this person has unearthed, without really trying to have a more holistic view as to what was the society in which these particular scientific achievements were made. On the other hand, those who pay more attention to the history part of the history of science tend to be relatively not that informed about the science, so very frequently they have recourse to certain generalizations about civilizations and cultures that produce the science that tend to be much more befuddling than illuminating. This happens especially to be the case, I presume it is also in the case of European science, but in the case of Islamic science, this happens to be the case, in that we have very frequently Westerners writing about it fall prey to certain notions, 19th century notions I would call them, to be polite. If I were not polite, I would call them racist, but in any case. So we don't really have a proper history of the sciences in the Islamic world. So it is a great privilege for all of us to be listening to a set of lectures by somebody who is trying to approach the issue, I think, as it should be approached, and to be writing a book this year as a Carnegie Scholar on this particular subject, and of course to be sharing his findings with us. So I will stop talking, and I will give the floor to Ahmad Dallal to tell us this time, after his first lecture on the preparation, of course, on the background of the sciences in the Islamic world, and the second one in which he compared three scientists, especially in the way in which they approached the very important issue of epistemology, of how to know things and how to evaluate knowledge and how we know it. Today he will give us, I think, that context in which these things happened, the religious context of Islam, in his lecture on science and religion. Ahmed.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dimitri, for the kind introduction. In the previous lecture, we looked at debates in the realm of science. Even when we considered views by religious scholars, or when the views of scientists might have been initially driven by religious unease, these debates were eventually conducted on epistemological grounds. As we've seen in the first lecture, however, there were important religious debates which pertain to the nature of scientific knowledge, the intellectual authority of science, and the social and institutional authority of scientists. It is, of course, a truism to say that the relationship between science and religion in Muslim societies is multifaceted, which could have only been the case given the temporal and geographical spans of the scientific enterprise in these societies, and, of course, given the diversity of intellectual traditions that informed views about this relationship. More generally, although I'm arguing that a major trend in medieval Islamic culture was to argue the autonomy of discrete forms of knowledge, science as an intellectual construct could not have constituted a neutral system of axioms and laws free of belief. Asserting distinction was itself part of a meaningful epistemological project, but not necessarily an objective description of the reality of scientific or religious thought as socially and culturally embedded phenomena. The very attempts to assert a distinction were themselves reflections of particular forms of historical and epistemological communication between science and religion. As I already noted, the traditional Orientalist assertion of a fundamental opposition between science and religion is, to put it mildly, no longer tenable. However, the notion of inherent conflict between science and religion is as problematic as the opposite notion of inherent harmony and unity. In the previous lecture, I've argued that there were multiple and at times conflicting epistemological assumptions in the practice of science. Religious discourse on science was equally diverse, ranging from assertions of opposition and conflict on the one end to harmony and unity on the other end, with a whole range of attitudes in between. In other words, both religious opposition to and endorsement of science took different forms and were based on doctrinal reasoning, notions of utility and usefulness, or epistemological criticism or sanction. Science and religion, the sacred and the rational, intersected in numerous cultural spaces. Again, as we saw in the first lecture, at the formal level, science and religion interacted socially and institutionally in the persons of the very practitioners of both science and religion, in parallel institutional structures, in allied disciplines, and so on and so forth. We also saw how scientific and religious disciplines intersected, as in the case of the sciences of miqat, timekeeping, and fara'id, the algebra of inheritance. All of these forms of interaction, however, were circumstantial, and we still need to consider the conceptual interaction between science and religion. In this lecture, I will trace in the realm of religious thought trends that correlate to the epistemological developments in the realm of the sciences. To be sure, my starting assumption, and there is an assumption that I'm starting with, is that a living scientific culture that had a vibrant duration for at least 7 or 8 centuries could not have flourished in isolation from other cultural forces, especially religion. In other words, Islamic science developed in the context of Islamic culture and not despite this culture, as indeed many historians have argued. The task of today's lecture, therefore, is to try to substantiate this common sense assumption by identifying specific developments in religious thought that correspond to and reinforce the conceptual developments in scientific thought. So where do we look? At the most basic level, the Quran is full of injunctions and encouragement for people to reflect on the outside world and the world within, which people quote all the time. Also, at the most basic level, in the Islamic religious law, certain kinds of knowledge are classified. There are 2 kinds of religious obligations. Ones which are individualized, which are required from every individual person, such as prayer and fasting and so on, and others which are considered collective obligations, which a community has to fulfill. So knowledge of medicine, for example, to deal with the welfare of the community is considered what is called a collective obligation, fard kifaya, as is, for example, knowledge of grammar to understand the Quran and so on and so forth. So this is also another very basic level. However, beyond such straightforward acceptance of or rejection of science, one can also note the possible role of religious and theological debates, both within the Islamic community and between Muslims and non-Muslims. These debates played a role in motivating Muslims to seek intellectual ammunition in the arsenal of ideas available to them. Of course, the most obvious source that had already shaped Christian theology in the early formative period was Greek philosophy, and in turn, Muslim theologians drew on this philosophy and on the philosophical sources to develop their own theological arguments. In some instances, religious doctrine had a direct effect on shaping scientific practice. Again, to give just one example, astrology, which was an integral component of the Greek scientific legacy, was criticized by many scientists, philosophers, and religious scholars, both on epistemological grounds, but also because it contradicted the religious doctrines of Islam. And as George Saliba has argued, the development of the discipline of Hay'a, which is mathematical astronomy, a particular form of mathematical astronomy, completely devoid of astrology, was, in a sense, a reaction to this critique. Another gauge of the relationship between science and religion, I'm just going over these minor issues before I sort of plunge into the crux of the discussion. Another gauge of the relationship between science and religion is the way scientists perceived of their practices in relation to religious knowledge. Biruni, whom I've mentioned so many times so far, and I will mention today again, definitely an eminent representative of the scientific tradition, may have also echoed trends in religious thinking about science. In his anthropological history of India, Biruni starts a chapter on the configuration of the heavens and the earth according to Indian astrologers, not astronomers. He starts this section with a long comparison between the cultural imperatives of Muslim and Indian sciences. The views of Indian astrologers, Biruni maintains, and I'm quoting here, have developed in a way which is different from those of our Muslim fellows. This is because, unlike the scriptures revealed before it, the Quran does not articulate on this subject of astronomy or any other field of necessary knowledge any assertion that would require erratic interpretations in order to harmonize it with that which is known by necessity. It's a little convoluted, but I'm trying to remain faithful to the original. The Quran, adds Biruni, does not speak on matters which are subjects of endless differences, such as history. To be sure, Islam has suffered from people who claimed to be Muslims, but retained many of the teachings of earlier religions and claimed that these teachings are part of the doctrines of Islam. Such, for example, were the Manichaeans. Again, I'm talking about Biruni here, not myself. Such, for example, were the Manichaeans, whose religious doctrine, together with their erroneous views about the heavens, were wrongly attributed to Islam. Such attributions of scientific views to the Quran are, according to Biruni, false claims of un-Islamic origins. In contrast, all the religious and transmitted books of the Indians do indeed speak of, and I'm quoting Biruni again, the configuration of the universe in a way which contradicts the truth which is known to their own astrologers. End of quote. So, driven by the need to uphold the religious traditions, Indian astrologers, according to Biruni, pretend to believe in the astrological doctrines of these books, even when they were aware of their falsity. With the passage of time, accurate astronomical doctrines were mixed with those advanced in the religious books, which led to the confusion one encounters in Indian astronomy. Now, although not all Indian religious views contradict the dictates of the astronomical profession, the conflation of religious and astronomical knowledge undermines Indian astronomy and accounts for its errors and weaknesses. By the way, this might be a very wrong interpretation by Biruni. I'm just presenting it because it sort of sheds light of how he thinks of his own profession vis-a-vis religion. So the conflation of scripture and science is contrasted by Biruni with the Islamic astronomical tradition, which, in his view, suffers from no such shortcomings. In Biruni's view, therefore, the Quran, and therefore religion more broadly, does not interfere in the business of science, nor does it infringe on its realm. As we will soon see, Biruni was not off the mark in his assessment of the Quranic attitude towards science. Perhaps more relevant to our purposes is the systematic discussion and epistemological assessment of science by religious scholars and by Muslim intellectuals. Numerous important religious thinkers, such as Ibn Hazm, who died in 1064, Ghazali, the famous Ghazali, whom I'll come back to, who died 1111, Ibn Taymiyyah, a very famous 14th century thinker, died in 1328. All of these and many others dedicated significant portions of their writings to the discussion of various sciences and to scientific knowledge and its relation to religious knowledge. Many of the classifications of science were written by religious scholars, and they reflect the diversity of assessments of science by these scholars. Some classifications simply list the rational sciences and the religious or traditional sciences under two separate categories without commenting on their relationship or relative value. Other classifications underscore the utility of the rational sciences to the religious sciences as a way of legitimating them. Others still compare parallel structural features that relate some religious sciences to their rational counterparts, whether in terms of the modes of acquiring knowledge or the practical versus theoretical nature of the science, and so on and so forth. In addition, many classifications provide critical assessments of various scientific disciplines on ethical as well as epistemological grounds. We can go on listing many more areas of contact between science and religion, but rather than marshalling the testimonies of individual religious scholars or works in support, or for that matter in opposition to science, the question for us is whether we can trace general trends in these individual attitudes. To be able to generalize, we need to focus on the most salient treatments of the subject of science and scientific knowledge in religious writings. Not just the way communities of scientific knowledge conceived of their profession and research within the larger context of religion, but more importantly, the way scientific knowledge was situated within religious discourse. In what follows, I will try to address this question by examining two primary genres of religious scholarship: Tafsir, Quranic exegesis, and Kalam, the counterpart for theology, although Kalam has a broader meaning, speculative theology. I will also briefly examine the religious stand on causality, a subject of interest to many medieval Muslim scholars and, of course, to contemporary historians of Islamic science as well. Now, let me start with Tafsir. The Quranic attitude towards science, in fact, the very relationship between the two, is not readily identifiable. Almost all sources agree that the Quran condones, even encourages, the acquisition of science and scientific knowledge, and urges humans to reflect on the natural phenomena as signs of God's creation. Beyond this simple contention, however, there is a great disagreement over the position of science in the Quran. The main source in which Quranic paradigms of science are articulated is, in my view, the genre of Quranic exegesis, Tafsir. Much as they insist on grounding themselves in the immutable text of the Quran, exegetical works are repositories of larger cultural debates and reflect the prevailing views at their time and place. Of course, the genre of tafsir, again, tafsir means Quranic exegesis, is vast, and many exegetical works have nothing to say that is related to science. So rather than tracing the evolution of the exegetical views on science, which I'm not qualified to do, I will focus on some relevant representative works in this tradition and try to identify their general thrust. Traditional Quranic exegetical works contain plenty of material of possible scientific import. However, despite the contemporary interest in the Quran and science, this aspect of exegesis has not received much scholarly attention. One possible reason for this neglect is that collectively, these traditional materials do not add up to what might be legitimately called a scientific interpretation of the Quran. Traditional interpreters did not present themselves as engaging in such an interpretive exercise. A minority of traditional scholars, notably Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and another scholar by the name Jalal ad-Din Suyuti, who died in 1505, maintained that the Quran is a comprehensive source of knowledge, including scientific knowledge. Despite their claims, however, neither Ghazali nor Suyuti proceed to correlate in a systematic interpretive exercise the Quranic text to science. Moreover, there are no instances in which these two or other exegetes claim authority in scientific subjects on account of their knowledge of the Quran. To be sure, scientific subjects do come up in many medieval Quranic exegetical works, but their treatment in these sources is radically different from their contemporary counterpart, which I will discuss next time. The discussion of the contemporary approach will be part of next lecture, but now I will explore the paradigmatic treatment of the subject in classical works on Quranic exegesis. The instances of occurrence of scientific discourse in the classical Quranic commentaries are invariably mixed with other kinds of discourse that have no connection to science. Quran commentators had a distinct conception of what constitutes the main thematic emphasis of the Quran, and they often, though not always, presented their detailed discussions of various subjects within this framework. Thus, for example, in his commentary on the Quran, Fakhruddin al-Razi, on whom I will rely mostly in today's lecture, partly because if there is one exegete who really dealt with scientific issues, it's Razi more than any other person. So Razi, who died in 1210, is a very good representative of the extent to which interpreters, Quranic exegetes, dealt with scientific questions. So in his commentary on the Quran, Fakhruddin al-Razi spells out the four themes around which the various discussions of the Quran revolve. Significantly, the verse in question, in which he spells out in the course of which he spells out these principles, relates to the natural order. It reads, the verse reads, "Surely your Lord is God, who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, then assumed the throne. He covers up the day with night, which comes chasing it fast. And the sun and the moon and the stars are subjugated by his command. It is his to create and command. Blessed be God, the Lord of all the worlds." Now, before embarking on a lengthy discussion of this verse, Razi lists four overriding Quranic themes: the oneness of God, prophethood, resurrection, and the omnipotence of God, or the related question of predestination. All other themes, including the ones in this verse, ultimately underscore one of these four essential motifs, according to Razi. Razi proceeds to explain the manner in which this seemingly unrelated verse does indeed relate to the oneness and omnipotence of God. So, Razi lists several interpretations of the verse that would confirm this correlation. One is to argue that the heavens and the earth are created with a particular size, while their natures do not preclude the possibility of having a larger or smaller size. This shows, according to Razi, that a willing maker chose to give them this specific size and no other, thus proving the existence of a free and willing creator. Alternatively, the creation at a specific time of the heavens and the earth, when they could have been created at an earlier or later time, is an act of choice by God and not due to the inherent nature of either. The same argument also applies to the configurations and the positions of the various parts of the universe relative to each other, and so on. After a lengthy digression to disprove the attribution of place and direction to God, Razi then returns to the first theme, albeit with a different perspective. He enumerates the benefits that result from the succession of day and night, again, as proof that God creates the world in a specific fashion in order to maximize the benefit for humans from this world. Razi then undertakes a linguistic exploration, typical of Quranic commentaries of all kinds, of the meaning of the word subjugated, musakharat. The sun, he reports, has two motions. The cyclical rotation of one is completed in a year, while the other in a day. Night and day, however, are not due to the motion of the sun, but to the motion of the great orb, which is also, according to Razi, the throne, which is mentioned in the verse, the throne of God. Moreover, each heavenly body or planet has an angel assigned to it to move it when it rises and sets. And God has endowed the throne or the great outer orb with the power to influence all other orbs, thus enabling it to move them by compulsion from east to west in opposite direction to their west to east slow motion. This, according to Razi, is the meaning of subjugation, that orbs and planets are organized by God in a particular order for no inherent reason of their own, so that they produce the most optimal benefits for humans. Razi's approach is typical of many other commentaries, Zamakhshari and quite a few others, and even Qurtubi to some extent and others, both in its linguistic turn and in its emphasis on the benefits of creation to humans as evidence of the existence of the willing creator. Also notable about Razi's commentary is its denial of natural determinism and his insistence on assigning agency exclusively to God. Commentaries often focus not just on the meaning and appropriateness of using certain terms, but also the logic of their order of appearance in the Quran. For example, Razi explores the reason why the word heavens occurs before earth in most cases where the two are mentioned in the Quran. Amongst the virtues of the heavens is that it's ornamented by God with the bright stars, with the sun and the moon, as well as the throne, and the pen, and the preserved tablet. God also uses complementary names to refer to the heavens in order to underscore the high status of the heavens. Other merits of the heaven are that they are the abode of angels where God is never disobeyed, that prayers are directed to them, hands are raised towards them in supplication, and they have perfect color and shape. The one advantage of the heavens over the earth, which invokes a common scientific view of the time, is the notion that the heavenly world influences the sublunar world, whereas the earth is acted upon. Razi also lists some of the merits of the earth according to those who prefer it to the heavens, including the fact that prophets are sent in the earth, that is, and mosques for the worship of God are built in it. The noticeable absence in this comparison is of any discussion of a natural superiority of heaven over earth, which would be the standard argument of natural philosophy with which Razi was fully familiar. Razi actually composed a book on the subject. He was thoroughly familiar with the sciences, with natural philosophy, that is. Rather than using the Quran to elucidate science, or science to extract the proper meaning of the Quranic text, these quasi-scientific discussions often aim at explaining the order of words and at demonstrating the linguistic, rhetorical miracles of the Quran. Indeed, it's not just the creation of a perfect and wondrous word that is underscored in the commentaries, but also the fact that God refers to this creation by using words that cannot be emulated by the most eloquent humans. The marvel of creation is a recurrent theme of Quranic commentaries. These marvels are viewed as signs of God and proofs that He exists, that God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and is the willing creator of all being. One of the commonly cited verses which urge contemplation of the signs of the heavens and the earth is Quran 3:190-191, which reads as follows, quote, "In the creation of the heavens and the earth, the alteration of night and day are signs for the wise. Those who remember pray for God, standing or sitting or lying on their sides, who reflect and contemplate on the creation of the heavens and the earth, and say, not in vain have you," meaning God, "made them. All praise be to you, O Lord, preserve us from the torment of hell." End of quote. In his commentary on this verse, Razi contends that the human mind is incapable of comprehending the manner in which a small leaf on a tree is created, how it's structured, or how it grows. Needless to say, the larger task of discovering God's wisdom in the creation of the heavens and the earth is next to impossible. One must therefore concede that the Creator is beyond full comprehension. Instead, one must admit the utmost wisdom and great secrets of creation, even if there is no way of knowing what these are, what exactly there is. Ultimately, when people reflect on the heavens and the earth, they will come to realize that their Creator did not create them in vain, but for remarkable wisdom and great secrets, and that the intellects are incapable of comprehending them. Therefore, the ultimate purpose of reflection is to establish the limitations of human knowledge and its inability to comprehend creation, not to establish a scientific fact and demonstrate its correspondence with the Quran. Moreover, as understood in these commentaries, the contemplation which the Quranic text calls for is outside the text in nature and does not move back to the text, nor does it follow or correspond to any particular Quranic scheme. As such, contemplation does not imply a correlation between science, whether natural philosophy, astronomy, or medicine, and the Quran. The Quran, according to these commentaries, directs people to reflect on the wisdom of creation of nature, but provides no details on the natural order or of ways of deciphering it. These details, if and when they appear in classical Quranic commentaries, are drawn from the prevalent scientific knowledge of the time. Now, let me give a very brief overview of the mode in which commentators invoke creation as evidence of God and His traits, which illustrates this fundamental divide between science and the Quran. Classical commentaries often introduce, and I'm saying classical commentaries because, as you will see next time, there is a very, very different move in the modern period, which I will talk about briefly next time. Classical commentaries often introduce elaborate discussions of scientific subjects to illustrate the idea of God's wise choice of creation as a way of maximizing human benefit. For example, in his commentary on the Quran, Razi outlines the prerequisites for making the earth a bed, firash. After asserting that one of these prerequisites is that the earth does not move, Razi proceeds to prove his contention. If it were to move, Razi says, the earth's motion would be either linear or circular. If it's linear, it would be falling. Yet since heavier objects move faster than slower ones, then the earth would fall at a faster speed than people on its surface, which will be a problem. If, on the other hand, the earth's motion is circular, the benefit for humans from it would not be complete, since a person moving in a direction opposite to its motion would never reach his destination. Razi then surveys the evidence adduced by various scholars to prove that the earth is stationary. What follows is a quasi-again scientific discussion, which draws on but does not privilege science as the authoritative reference on the subject. And again, I remind you, Razi was thoroughly familiar, was a scholar of, he wrote on natural philosophy, so his natural philosophy is perfect, but he chooses not to invoke it in his exegesis. So, some scholars, Razi reports, argue that the earth is bottomless, and thus it has no bottom to move to, which is why it does not move. This view, Razi contends, is wrong because all created bodies are finite. The finitude of created bodies, it should be noted, is asserted on theological and not natural scientific grounds. Others concede the finitude of objects, but argue that the earth is still because it's a semi-sphere whose flat bottom floats on the surface of water. Razi rejects this argument on the grounds that even if this were true, both the earth and water in which it floats could be moving. Moreover, Razi wonders, why would one side of the earth be flat and the other round? Again, while Razi could have invoked arguments for the superiority for the sphericity of the earth, which are more in line with the sciences of the time, again, which he was thoroughly familiar with, his response is notably general and not grounded in science. Irrespective of how scientific these and other arguments appear to us from our modern perspective of science, irrespective of how they appear to us from our modern perspective, these discussions do not reflect the prevalent scientific views of Razi's time and of Razi himself. The closest Razi gets, however, to engaging this prevalent understanding of science is when he reports and rejects the Aristotelian argument that the earth, by nature, seeks the center of the universe. This, Razi notes, is the view of Aristotle and the majority of his followers among the natural philosophers. Razi's objection to this view is on the grounds that the earth shares the trait of physicality with all other bodies in the universe. And its acquisition of a specialized trait that makes it stationary is by necessity logically contingent. Thus, it is the free volition of the maker and not any inherent nature that accounts for the stillness of the earth. If anything, Razi adds, the nature of the earth is to sink in water, and God reverses its nature so that it does not submerge in water, in order to maximize the benefit for humans from it, and to make it a place over which they can reside. This, again, elaborate quasi-scientific discourse, which draws freely on scientific knowledge of the time, is evidently not aimed at upholding a particular scientific view of nature. Moreover, it's equally true that this discourse does not aim at making positive contributions to the accepted body of scientific knowledge. Rather, the primary purpose is to argue that the contingency of the created order and its ultimate dependence on God. Nowhere in this and other classical commentaries does one encounter the notion that that a certain scientific fact or theory is predicted or even favored by the Quran. Instead, these commentaries emphatically reject explanations of the Quranic verses that are grounded in the notion of a natural order. The signed verses serve as evidence of the Creator, not in the particular knowledge that they convey about nature, but in the ultimate conclusion in each and every verse that there is a choice in creation and thus a Creator who makes this choice. That the world, and I'm quoting Razi here, the world is created with perfect management, comprehensiveness, determination, utter wisdom, and infinite omnipotence. A related question is that of causality, which I will return to later today. Causality has been addressed extensively in connection to Ghazali and in the genre of Tafsir. Robert Morrison, for example, has examined the works of Razi and more so of Nishapuri. In both cases, Morrison has shown intermediary causes are posited in the cases of Razi, but more specifically in the case of Nishapuri. However, regardless of their specific position on intermediary causes, discussions of the natural phenomena conform with the general outlines of other classical commentaries in two main respects. First, in not using the Quran as a source of knowledge about nature, and second, the exposition of various scientific theories and explanations is seldom done for the purpose of favoring one over another. Rather, this exposition is usually undertaken to suggest that there are multiple possible explanations on which the Quran is neutral. Asserting the multiplicity of possible explanations of the natural phenomena is hardly compatible with a positivistic scientific outlook. Classical tafsirs, however, are full of such assertions. Most of the commentaries on the sign verses contain multiple interpretations, of which only some are connected to science. While some of these interpretations are rejected, many are allowed as acceptable possibilities. In many cases, information culled from scientific discourse is countered rather than confirmed by what is considered acceptable alternative interpretations. For example, Quran commentaries often maintain that the role of meteors is to preserve the heavens by driving away devils, or that the movement of the sun to a resting place, which is a Quranic verse, the tajri ila mustaqarrin laha, the sun moves to a resting place, refers to its movement to a point beneath the throne, beneath God's throne, where it prostrates, then rises again. So as a general rule, therefore, scientific knowledge is freely invoked and occasionally challenged in commentaries on the Quran. Yet the purpose of rejecting some scientific views is not to promote alternative ones, nor to assert the authority of the Quran at the expense of the various fields of science. In the absence of a clear statement in the Quran, one seeks answers to scientific questions in their respective fields. The contrary, however, is not true, since the text of the Quran is not science. When there is an apparent conflict between a Quranic text and a scientific fact, commentators do not present the Quranic text as the arbiter, but simply try to explore the possibility of alternative scientific explanations, and thus suggest that scientific knowledge on such points of contention is not categorical. It follows then from the above that religious knowledge and scientific knowledge are each assigned in the tafsir genre to their own compartments. This would justify the pursuit of science and even the use of scientific discourse in commenting on the Quran, but it would also limit this use. A case in point is Razi's contention that some ignorant people may object to his unusual use of the science of astronomy in explaining the Book of God. In response, he asserts that God has filled his book with proofs of his knowledge, power, and wisdom, which are inferred from the conditions of the heavens and the earth. If exploring these subjects and reflecting on them were not permissible, God would not have so frequently urged humans to reflect on these signs. I'm quoting Razi here. The science of astronomy has no other meaning than reflection on how God ordered the heavens and created its different parts. End of quote. The purpose of this exercise is not to establish correspondence between scientific verities and the Quran, but simply to reflect and hence reinforce belief in the creator of the impeccable universe. This kind of reflection for the aim of belief does not produce knowledge about the natural order. Despite all of his talk about the permissibility of using astronomy in exegesis, Razi asserts that all creation is from God, that the planets have no influence on the sublunar world, and that the assertion of nature's intellects, I'm quoting Razi here, the assertion of nature's intellects and souls in the manner advocated by philosophers and diviners is invalid, end of quote. These statements by Razi, however, are directed primarily at fellow religious scholars and not at scientists. When discussing the religious import of the Quran, commentators are urged to stay within the realm of the text and not try to impose astronomical knowledge on it, or, for that matter, feign a Quranic understanding of astronomy. The Quranic text to which Razi wants to restrict himself and his fellow commentators does not have a scientific import and does not translate into binding scientific facts. It underscores the wisdom and power behind creation, but says nothing about the exact order and workings of the created world. The complexity and wondrous nature of the world reinforce belief in God, but this is not contingent on the adoption of any particular scientific view. In fact, scientific facts and theories in themselves do not provide evidence of the oneness of the Creator. Rather, it's the very fact that other natural orders are possible that points to a willing maker who chooses one of these possibilities. According to this logic, everything in nature, however explained, as well as all scientific discoveries and facts, irrespective of their certainty, would serve as proofs for the existence of the maker. And this is the fundamental reason why the scientific and unscientific could appear side by side in the commentaries on the Quran. Now, let me move to theology. The genre of Islamic religious scholarship, which comes closest to philosophy, is without question Kalam, or speculative theology. I'll be using the word Kalam because of distinctions which we cannot get into now, but there are significant distinctions between the Islamic genre of theology, which is a little broader than theology proper as it's understood in a Western context. So, Kalam comes closest to philosophy, not only because reason and religious tradition intersect in it, but also because it is a genre which was shaped by deliberately drawing on the Greek philosophical tradition. In connection to natural science in particular, some early works of Kalam included substantial discussions of physics. In his work on the physical theory of early Kalam, and Nur Dhannani illustrates how significant aspects of physical theory, in particular theories of matter, space, time, and motion, were discussed in relatively early, not the earliest, but relatively early Kalam works. In contrast to the earlier Kalam works, the scientific focus of later Kalam works shifts from physics to astronomy. More generally, a notable development in the discipline of Kalam, at least notable to me, I think, over time was its increasing comprehensiveness. It becomes more systematic and comprehensive. Whereas the earliest works of Kalam were in effect inventories of doctrinal positions, these works quickly gained in complexity and systemization. Moreover, with the passage of time, the doctrinal aspects of these works decreased relative to the amount of specialized scientific knowledge incorporated into them. In fact, many of the great mathematical scientists of the later periods were also religious scholars who composed theological works as well as mathematical and astronomical works. On the basis of the increased incorporation of philosophical and astronomical discussions into theological works, some historians have argued that Kalam came to replace Aristotelian philosophy as the quintessential Islamic philosophy. As I will argue now, while there is no doubt that theological works became more coherent and systematic with the passage of time, these works were not aimed at providing a comprehensive alternative to Greek philosophy, or to claim the position of a comprehensive system of thought that underlies all other sciences. One of the most popular works on theology from the 14th century to the present is a work by a person by the name of Aduddin al-Iji, simple name, I-J-A-I, by the title Kitab al-Mawaqif fi Ilm al-Kalam. Anyway, never mind the title. In a study of Iji, Abdul Hamid Sabra, a distinguished historian of Islamic science, retired now, who used to teach at Harvard, argues that the theology in Iji's period emerges as an autonomous and, quote, truly Islamic philosophical system that exercises, or at least wishes to exercise, hegemony over all other intellectual disciplines, but subjects itself to none. In what follows, however, I will propose a different reading of Iji, and I think it's representative, at least, of Iji's work is representative of at least a significant portion of the works in Kalam in later periods. In his definition of Kalam, Iji maintains that it is, and I'm quoting, a science through which it is possible to confirm religious dogma either by means of providing proofs or removing ambiguities. End of quote. E.g. adds that even an adversary with whom he may disagree may still count as a scholar of Kalam. Allow me to read the sentence for you in Arabic. I think it's important, and I'll explain in a minute why. فإن الخصم وإن خطأناه لا نخرجه من علماء الكلام. Clearly, therefore, the truth of Kalam, according to E.G., is not an absolute truth. It's a relative truth, because otherwise he wouldn't include his opponents as members of the discipline. E.G. also maintains that the questions of Kalam include, quote, every theoretical judgment concerning a knowable thing which is either one of the religious beliefs or one on which the establishment of a religious belief depends. To be sure, E.G. maintains that Kalam is the most noble discipline. This, however, is simply on account of the nobility of the subject matter of Kalam, which is, of course, the divine, and the divine and related matters, and not because of a privileged status of theological knowledge in fields other than theology. Moreover, the notion that, according to E.G., other sciences depend on Kalam, whereas it depends on none, needs some qualification. What E.G. actually says is that Kalam does not depend on the evidence of other derived disciplines, but its starting point remains transmitted evidence, dalil al-naql, in the words of E.G. In other words, it still depends on scripture, so it depends on something outside of it. And it sets out to prove the religious dogma that has already been established through transmission. Perhaps a more important issue here is whether Kalam represented a complete and purely Islamic philosophical system. Sabra contrasts this notion of Kalam as a philosophical system and a genuine intellectual pursuit with the common understanding of Kalam as an apologetic exercise. It is possible, however, to conceive of Kalam as an apologetic undertaking, which is not a complete philosophical system, without diminishing its value as a genuine intellectual pursuit. I mean, it can be apologetic and genuinely intellectual. It doesn't have to be either or. In fact, this is how E.G. presents Kalam. For example, in a discussion of the reasons for which the word Kalam, which means in Arabic speaking, literally it means speaking, in a discussion of the reason for which the word Kalam is used to designate the field of theology, E.G. mentions three possibilities. Either that it was called Kalam because it involved disputation with philosophy, or because it was named after the most controversial question discussed in it, namely the speech, the Kalam of God, or because it provides its practitioner with the ability to engage in debates over religious subjects and to respond to opponents. Again, all three possibilities involve disputation as the central undertaking of Kalam. It involves disputation and apologetics. Moreover, Kalam as conceived by E.G. was not a complete philosophical system, and its scope of intellectual authority was certainly not comparable to the scope claimed in philosophy proper. In fact, despite all his professions regarding the greatness of theology of Kalam, E.G.'s ultimate purpose was to undermine the comprehensive claims of philosophy as a complete system of knowledge, and not to create an alternative comprehensive system. This is what underlies E.G.'s recurrent assertions that it's possible to imagine explanations of various natural phenomena which are different from the ones presented by philosophers as definite and conclusive explanations. The Kalam for which E.G. claimed authority in religious matters had no other epistemological claims outside the field of Kalam itself. In other words, outside the subject matter of God and related issues. Thus, for example, a standard format of E.G.'s exposition of various astronomical theories, of which there are quite a few, astronomical theories or theories of natural philosophy. I mean, quite a substantial part of E.G.'s book is on astronomy. But invariably, recurrently, E.G. uses the following expression: لما لا يجوز. Why is it not possible to posit an alternative explanation? لما لا يجوز is the term. Why is it not possible to posit an alternative explanation? Such alternatives, however, are never advocated by E.G. Rather, in conclusion of his extensive discussion of astronomical problems, he maintains that the orbs and circles that are posited in astronomical models are all, and I'm quoting here, imaginary things, أمور موهومة, that have no external existence. لا وجود لها في الخارج. أمور موهومة لا وجود لها في الخارج. Imaginary things that have no external existence. Religious prohibition does not extend to them, and they are neither objects of belief nor subjects of affirmation or negation. That's his conclusion. Basically, he's saying it's not our business to make a positive statement on matters of astronomy. In other words, these matters do not belong to theology, and Kalam has no say on them. E.g. only mentions them to undermine their inclusion by philosophers in theological arguments. He also objects to the attribution of various astronomical phenomena to the volition of the heavenly objects and reserves final agency to God. In his words, quote, "The purpose of reporting these differences is so that a rational and smart person may confirm that they have no proof, ithbat, no proof for what they claim," end of quote. Rather than exerting the hegemony of Kalam over these other disciplines, E.g. simply tries to disengage these disciplines and to guard the autonomy and separateness of the specialized fields of knowledge. Put differently, for E.g., religion does not provide principles for the sciences and does not play a selective role in the evaluation of rival scientific theories. Now, I'll skip over a section which I have on Sadr al-Sharia al-Bukhari, who composed an encyclopedia, a 3-volume encyclopedia. The first volume was on logic, the second on Kalam, and the third on astronomy. Suffice it to say here is that the tendency in this work, again, very similar sort of impulse as in E.G., except that the work on astronomy is a real work on astronomy, as opposed to E.G., who mentions astronomy simply to say there is no theological stand on it. What I want to say about this particular work and other similar works, I think, is that the tendency seems to be the influence of astronomy on theology rather than the other way around. There is no apparent influence that one can detect from the theology of Sadr al-Sharia on his astronomical work, and it actually works the other way. To sum up then, just as in Tafsir, a main trend in the discipline of theology was to disengage the specialized sciences from their original philosophical framework and from the metaphysical in general, thereby allowing these sciences to restructure themselves free of the demands of natural philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. The new Kalam works did not offer an alternative metaphysics to guide and bind science. In fact, rather than being a source for knowledge on physical theory, later Kalam works were themselves informed by developments in the field of astronomy. As a result, the scope of Kalam was redefined and transformed from an encompassing system of knowledge to one with limited epistemic authority outside the area of metaphysics. Now, a couple of words about the problem of causality. Almost invariably, discussions of the Islamic attitude towards science invoke the works of Ghazali in many different ways. I will not attempt to summarize Ghazali's views on the various sciences. These views have received more scholarly attention than any by other Muslim scholars who had written on the subject. It is important to note, though, that the debate regarding Ghazali's true attitudes and views continues amongst contemporary scholars. And there seems to be no final consensus, even over the interpretation of his most famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, let alone an integrated assessment of his whole oeuvre. So, Ghazali remains very much a subject which is evolving, a subject of discussion and debate, and there is quite a lot yet, I think, to discover in Ghazali. And I will not address Ghazali in his totality, only in connection to the question of causality. Numerous historians have focused on Ghazali's denial of causality and argued that by denying a cornerstone of natural science, Ghazali undermined the very possibility of scientific knowledge. So let's look a bit more closely at Ghazali's view on this subject. In his Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Ghazali delivers a systematic criticism of what he considers to be the flaws and shortcomings of philosophy in matters related to metaphysics. Ghazali maintains that his difference with philosophers falls into 3 categories. The first related to linguistic conventions, which he says he's not going to address. The second includes matters which do not involve the denial of a religious principle. And then he proceeds to say that believing in the doctrines of messengers and prophets and so on, if all of these things are not undermined by philosophical assertions, then there is no need to oppose the philosophers on these matters. Someone, and I'm quoting Ghazali here, someone who thinks that denying these matters is part of religion commits an aggression against religion and weakens it, because geometrical and mathematical proofs over which there is no doubt are founded on these matters. Thus, someone who learns these things, meaning the rational sciences, and verifies their certainty would only doubt religion and not this science if he's told that the two are in opposition. End of quote. Ghazali then responds to a possible religious objection to his assertion that this part of the philosophical sciences is not outside the scope of religion. A critic, Ghazali adds, might invoke a tradition of the Prophet which says, quote, "The sun and the moon are two of the signs of God. They are not eclipsed for anyone's death or life. So if you see an eclipse, rush to mention God and pray." End of quote. Ghazali retorts that there is nothing in this tradition which undermines the natural explanation of the eclipse. Furthermore, he basically says it's only saying that you should pray if you see one. It doesn't undermine the natural explanation of an eclipse. Furthermore, the command to pray at eclipses, just as the command to pray at sunset and sunrise, is a conventional religious obligation which has nothing to do with the natural phenomena of the eclipse. Ghazali then says that even if there is a tradition that contradicts scientific knowledge, it would be far better to interpret it than posit it in opposition to certain knowledge. Nothing pleases the enemies of religion, Ghazali declares, more than its statement by their rivals asserting that such certain knowledge is in opposition to religion. Now, the inquiry into the natural world that concerns Ghazali, and I'm quoting here, is over whether it's eternal or created. Once it's determined, I continue the quote, once it's determined that it's created, it does not really matter whether it's a sphere or a plane or a hexagon or a pentagon, and whether the heaven and what is below it is 13 layers, as they claim, as the astronomers claim, or natural philosophers actually, or more or less than that. Assigning inquiry into this matter to metaphysics is similar to assigning to it the inquiry into the layers of an onion or the number of the seeds of a pomegranate. The only thing that's relevant to metaphysics is that the world is created by God, irrespective of its form. End of quote. In this manner, Ghazali expresses his desire to disengage natural science, or at least the empirical part of natural science, as well as mathematics from metaphysics. The only part which ought to be opposed, according to Ghazali, and undermined in the philosophical legacy is that which relates to conflict over one of the principles of religion, such as the belief that the world is created, the attributes of the Creator, and the resurrection of bodies. In fact, Ghazali does not only argue that the mathematical sciences and most of physics are epistemologically distinct from metaphysics, but also that metaphysics does not rely on these sciences in its assertions. Now, let me move a little forward to save some time and talk a little bit about causality. Ghazali attributes causality to habit and concomitance. For example, we are used from our observation of the recurrence of events and from the observation of the concomitance of two events to expect that when a piece of cotton is touched with fire, it will burn. The expectation of burning, however, according to Ghazali, is not established through demonstrative proof. Logically, all we can demonstrate is that burning occurs when and not because fire and cotton are brought together. According to Ghazali, the causal connection is a mental assumption we make in our minds and is not between the concomitant natural phenomena. Put differently, the laws of causality do not apply to nature but to our knowledge of it and to the nature of perception which God creates in humans. In this manner, Ghazali questions the deterministic connection between cause and effect in nature, while asserting that the only possible knowledge about nature is one which is predicated on a perception of this very causal nexus. It thus follows that it's possible to organize knowledge about nature in a science, which assumes causality, and to order the partial perception about the natural phenomena in a system of knowledge. To be sure, according to Ghazali, God's ultimate causes are not knowable, which means that all knowledge about the natural world is contingent and not certain. However, this knowledge is derivable from the word itself. So there is a distinction between knowledge of the natural order, which is subject to laws of causation, and a deterministic notion of a relationship out there between cause and effect. Ghazali's notion of habitual order and his denial of causality are grounded in the Ash'arite doctrine of atomism. According to this doctrine, God creates the world in all of its details in successive discrete moments, so that what we conceive of as a continuous natural order is in fact a series of independent moments created separately by God. As such, the natural order we observe can be disrupted at will by God, and this disruption explains the possible occurrence of miracles. On the other hand, the habitual order of God's continuous creation produces in us knowledge of a habitual natural order which describes the manner in which God chooses to act in the world. The result then is a natural order in our minds which is not binding on God and yet is bound by the natural world as we perceive it. Ghazali's views on the various sciences were quite influential, and in some cases there is evidence of the direct effect of these views on the development of some scientific disciplines. Yet the aspect of Ghazali's views and those of Ash'arite scholars in general, Ash'arite theologians in general, the dominant school of theology in Islam, the aspect of their thought which had the most influence on the development of science was the concept of multiple possibilities, the concept of tajweez. Thank you so much, Dimitri. I actually have one here. Thank you. The concept of multiple possibilities, tajweez in Arabic. The notion that specific natural philosophical explanations or planetary models for that are possible but not certain. A similar attitude is detectable in Tafsir and a variety of theological works, and is echoed in the works of scientists, starting with Biruni and all the way to Khafri, whom you might remember, argued for the mathematical equivalency of different astronomical models. As we have seen, this idea was grounded in an epistemological criticism of metaphysics, but it did not impose an Islamic metaphysics in its place. In other words, Islamic theology helped undermine the metaphysical foundation of the old sciences without claiming a role for Islamic doctrine in the cognitive development of these sciences. Now, let me race to the conclusion. As I frequently noted in all three lectures, the context and conceptions of the relationship between science, philosophy, and religion in classical Islamic culture were extremely diverse. This makes it hard to characterize this relationship with any finality. Yet I tried to provide evidence for at least one important epistemological approach that characterized the practice of science in classical Muslim societies, an approach which emerged as a conscious alternative to Greek philosophical epistemologies. Greek philosophy continued to thrive and evolve, but many of the most important developments in the sciences occurred in the context of this new epistemology. The first important consequence of this new epistemology was to disinvest scientific knowledge of religious meaning, notwithstanding the marvels of God's creations. The pursuit of natural knowledge was no longer subordinated to metaphysical concerns, and as a result, it was also no longer subordinated to theological concerns. After Ghazali, the need to invoke religion to vindicate science considerably decreased, not because science was not accepted, but because it did not need vindication. Excluding final cause explorations from science did not compromise the providence of God, which was assumed without how, bila kayf. When we read Iji alongside Ghazali and works of Tafsir, it becomes abundantly clear that diminishing the authority of the Quran in matters of natural philosophy was not a concern for these thinkers, because this authority, as Biruni clearly asserted, was never assumed in the first place. Therefore, the exclusion of first cause explorations from science simply alleviated the burden of metaphysics and freed scientists to pursue the knowable. The ultimate meaning of any particular science was no longer sought by necessity in a higher philosophical or religious truth, but within the distinct sphere of autonomous scientific knowledge. This new epistemological posture paved the road to the Qibla of Ahl Fas, with which I opened my first lecture, the debate over the Qibla of Fas. Now science could boldly claim authority based on secular reason, even in the sacred space of religious ritual. To be sure, this autonomy came at a price. For good or for worse, science did not turn into an ethical value to which other values would be subordinated. Yet while religion dominated the moral sphere and claimed the higher rank on account of the nobility of its subject matter, which is God, it did not exercise an epistemological hegemony over science. Simply put, the unity of knowledge, which would give meaning to a hierarchical ranking of systems of knowledge, was no longer assumed, irrespective of whether science comes first or religion comes first. This lens then leads us to the second major consequence of the new epistemology. Conceiving of science as a culturally neutral, that is, universal activity, is the second consequence. The ideal of cultural neutrality is eloquently captured by Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century historian, Ibn Khaldun, who refers to the rational sciences as sciences shared among all the nations. And I'm quoting Ibn Khaldun here. The intellectual sciences, Ibn Khaldun maintains, are natural to man inasmuch as he is a thinking being. They are not restricted to any particular religious group. They are studied by the people of all religious groups who are all equally qualified to learn them and to do research in them. They have existed and been known to the human species since civilization had its beginnings in the world. And with this ideal of neutrality, it was possible to pursue the sciences for their intellectual merits independent of any connection to religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. It's food for thought. Questions?
I'm overwhelmed by the rational sciences that you've described here, but all the rational scientists seem to deal with cosmology. Were the scholars of this time interested in the living world in any sense? I don't want to call them biologists, but the notion that God's world that we have to look at includes animals, plants, humans.
Of course, even many. I mean, there is the
medicine I carve out from this. Being
there is, starting with Biruni. Biruni composed on plants, a book on plants. He composed another book on mineralogy and so on and so forth. Yes, of course. I mean, this was a very lively subject. I mean, these were lively subjects. Issues of relationship to religion do not come up in these disciplines, which is why I didn't talk about them in my lectures, because what I'm trying to look at is the relationship between science and religion, and between scientific knowledge and religious knowledge. And they don't come up as often. I did mention last time, I mean, they are more relevant, actually, the life sciences. They are a bit more relevant to the second lecture, because you could see on the question of the principles of the various disciplines, you could see a very definite trend. I mean, it's not the exclusive one, but this very definite trend to argue for the derivation of the principles of the sciences from within the sciences themselves, as opposed to imposing principles from one discipline to the other. That's one thing. Also, in medicine, for example, if you compare, for example, the work of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, which I've done on one particular issue on the physiology of reproduction, you could see that Ibn Sina is trying to reconcile the initial Aristotelian assumptions on this subject, which denies any role for women in the act of reproduction and attributes all agency to the male semen, and the later discovery by Galen of the female testicles, which he argues are inverted, and but they are, both semens are essential for reproduction and so on. And you could see how Ibn Sina, who's very loyal, a loyal Aristotelian, is trying to reconcile both. And later on, you get Ibn Rushd, whom I mentioned in connection to astronomy, who wants to redeem a very outdated natural philosophy at the expense of all the findings in astronomy. He does the same thing in medicine. He denies any role for quote unquote, the female semen in reproduction. And he denies all the attempts by Ibn Sina and by many generations of physicians to actually reconcile findings from the principles of Aristotelian natural philosophy and the empirical findings, later empirical findings. So, I mean, you could, in the various disciplines, last time I also talked about, agriculture and the whole debate over, the philosopher peasants are the ideal, scientists and the ideal sort of practitioners of the science of agriculture, of agronomy, because they combine philosophical principles with empirical knowledge and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, these things come up, but the most elaborate debates on the relationship between systems of knowledge are found in, as can be expected, are found in cosmology and astronomy and so on.
Ahmed, my question is to your treatment of E.G. and his Kitab al-Mawaqif, where you say that countering Sabra, you don't see any authority that in this case the discourse claims by itself, so to speak, and in this case where it says, but even in the quotation that you give by E.G., that the real authority of the discourse lies in the notion of proof, of burhan, and as such, it is something that the mutakallim in this case, the person in this case who pursues kalam at this period at least, says, well, that's something that I'm interested in, whether we have a proof on this side and whether we have a proof on the cosmological theories. Now, of course, you're quite correct, of course, that there's a long debate about possible cosmological explanations, and there is tajweez, meaning in this case that maybe the stars. Of course, we knew that the stars move in spheres and all that. But about whether they truly have an influence on events in the sublunar sphere, there is no proof about that. And as you know by now, we no longer believe that by and large. So you can say that there still is an institution in this case that gives a certain authority that even counters, one might say,
That even so?
the counters, in this case, that stands against. Counters is probably not the right word, but that stands against the wording of the Quran, whatever is there, the Zahir al-Nasr, however you put it, the Zahir al-Quran. In this case, and that these two institutions are basically the ones that are waged, more or less, in the discourse of Kalam. But the way I see it, actually, anytime these people truly, like someone like E.G. truly accepts that the burhan, that a proof, a demonstrative proof has been achieved, they are on the side of that particular position.
Yes and no. The concept of burhan is certainly central, but then it's a burhan. I mean, he quite clearly says, this is the realm, this is the subject matter of my discipline. And he's very clear on that subject matter. So what he wants to provide is proofs related to issues of metaphysics and not other issues. And he's very explicit on saying, after he goes after one model after the other and arguing that, this person, and he knows his astronomy very well, quite clearly, and that's why people got confused. There is a lot of astronomy in this book. Going after one model after the other, he always concludes by saying, I'm not trying to take sides on these matters. I'm just simply saying that there are some people who include proofs derivable from these sorts of cosmology in matters of metaphysics to sound more authoritative. And I'm just trying to tell you, he says, that they're not. These are not related matters. I'm not trying to take sides in this debate. I think that is quite very significant. Now, in the whole concept of tajweez, it's not just E.G., but Ghazali as well, and everyone. I mean, and Biruni for that. If you want to look at the counterpart, it's not. Ghazali says, it's not beyond God to create when he talks about the possibility of an organic cosmos, he says it's not beyond God to create a cosmos which has life in it, which has a soul. And simply because it's huge and spherical doesn't mean that it can't have a soul. It could be big and round and still have a soul. So it says this is not, but he says the point is there is no way of proving that, And that's why, he says people, and then the next sort of argument is that people who sort of use these smart arguments within the realm of metaphysics to try to appear as if they really know what they're talking about should be excluded. I mean, this is the point. It's not to take sides or to deny the possibility. I mean, but ultimately, the whole notion of multiple possibilities, as I suggested in the talk, is not compatible with the way, at least, sciences were perceived at the time. It's a very different approach to science. It's a very, as approach from the philosophical. Yes, of course. Which, where there is truth, and the subject of science and philosophy is to look for the ultimate truth. معرفة الأمور كما هي, knowing things as they really are out there, and there is only one possibility. This is ruled out in this debate. What's asserted is multiple possibilities, number one, and secondly, the separateness of things. When there is proof, they don't deny the proof. They're keen on saying, whether it's Ghazali or E.G. or whatever, and almost invariably, Ghazali and Razi and E.G., there are instances where they address the opponent who criticizes them for using astronomical proofs and mathematical proofs, and they say it's not against religion to use these proofs, so they defend the use of demonstrative proof in their discourse, whether it's tafsir or in tahafut and so on. But ultimately, they do insist that they're not taking sides, and there are multiple possibilities, and also on, I think, what I read as a separation of various realms of knowledge.
If I may follow up on that, Ahmed, these multiple possibilities and this separation, the autonomy of the spheres of knowledge, in a sense, that is created, then this creates an atmosphere where skepticism, of course, of ever knowing what is really happening, obviously, might grow. And do you think that may be one of the factors that has to be considered in considering the development of the sciences in Islam?
Or the decline of the sciences? It doesn't, that's not what happens. In the actual practice of science, science continues to develop unhindered till the 16th century. There is intensive scientific activity. So while, again, to use the notion of tajweez, it is possible that this could have resulted in something like this. In actual reality, it didn't. In actual reality, it does not result in a skepticism about the sciences. The scientists themselves, of whom there are quite a few, even the same people, someone like Sadr al-Sharia, when he's writing his, he writes his book on theology, in which he very clearly limits the scope of theology. Then he moves on to astronomy. And in astronomy, there is no skepticism or indefiniteness or anything. There is mathematical astronomy, and he's as positivist as you can get. So it didn't actually affect individuals, even individuals who were promoting this theological idea in the realm of Kalam. It didn't affect their own practice of science. And much more broadly, the practice of science seems to have continued unabated. So I don't, it could have, but it didn't, I think. I don't see that as, and therefore I don't agree with the explanation, with one explanation of decline, because it doesn't seem to correspond to what happened actually, to the historical record.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.